Welcome all. My name is John Bird, and I'm representing the Strategic Studies Department here at Joint Special Operations University. Today we are pleased to present a distinguished speaker, including audience Q&A. This session is unclassified and will be recorded and posted to the JSOW network. Please keep in mind that the views and the opinions expressed by all participants do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the U.S. government, Department of Defense, or U.S. SOCOM. If you have questions after this session, please email thinkjsow@socom.mil as indicated on the slide. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Dr. David Ellis, with the professor at the Institute for Soft Strategic Studies at the Joint Special Operations University. It is my pleasure to have as our special guest today, Brigadier General retired Robert Spalding. He is an accomplished national security policy strategist. He has served in senior positions of strategy and diplomacy within the Department of State and Department of Defense for more than 26 years, retiring as a Brigadier General. He was the chief architect for the current national security strategy and the senior director for strategy to the president at the National Security Council. General Spalding's innovation while serving in the White House has led to a reset in national security and public policy regarding telecommunications in the US, as well as globally. Dr. Spalding holds a doctorate in economics and mathematics from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. He is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C., and the author of Stealth War: How China Took Over While America's Elite Slept. And this is what we would like to discuss principally with General Dr. Spalding today. Sir, it's great to have you here with us, and we're looking forward to a wonderful conversation. If I could ask the audience to please make sure that your microphones or your audio is muted, we'll begin our discussion. General Spalding, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So let's jump right in. We have as much time as your schedule permits, but I'd like to offer you a moment to provide for the audience an overview of the call to action you have in Stealth Wars. Would you mind providing an overview for us?
Well, when you look at what the Chinese Communist Party has done, really it's leveraging globalization and the internet to achieve their interests. And when we think of national security, at least for me as a B-2 pilot, I was always focused on, what part do we play in an overall fight? And it's really, you can directly trace kind of the way we think about warfare back to, Western Europe and Clausewitz, the idea that you apply military force to achieve a political outcome. One of the things that you don't really understand about China until you dig into it, and one of the things that globalization and the internet has really enabled is this ability to extend their concept of the battlefield, which is completely different from ours, in a way very much like the United States has become a global force around the world. So the Chinese are a global force around the world. It's just that their battlefield is different, and the way they approach that model of war is politics by other means is more aligned with the idea that politics is war, and that the entire the way that you approach national security, particularly in an interconnected world, like Thomas Friedman wrote about, when the world is the world is flat, is the idea that you leverage those tools that have been created to connect the world, and that's what the Chinese Communist Party has done so well. So the thesis is really they've been able to export their brand of warfare globally, while we have been essentially distracted, looking at the adversary through our own kind of lens.
So the main, I guess, axis of advance is not the military in this frame. It's actually finance and economics. Would you help us understand a little bit more of how they leverage those tools, and then perhaps afterwards how you came to appreciate how they see the world and approach this political opportunity?
Right. So, there's many different aspects to it. So I go back to Kosovo when we were going after Milosevic's accomplices, just using an understanding of his network, who was backing him, we started to go after other assets. One of them was a factory. I remember, B-2 strike took out with several JDAMs. What happened to me in 2014 is I was sent a report by, a guy that had been invested, heavily in China on behalf of his customers. He worked for JP Morgan for, 3 decades. And he sent me this report that had a number of vignettes of companies in the United States that had been attacked. So we took out a factory with JDAMs. In that report, I was looking at factories and companies that were taking out using the levers of finance. And when I say the levers of finance, the sophisticated attack used specific knowledge that our own private equity companies would have in terms of how they acquire, grow, sell a company. And then that was used to basically undermine, devalue, and then acquire the company. And so when we think about, and it was presented as cyber economics, but in reality the cyber was an enabler for what was an economic attack. And when I looked at that and I took a step back and I said, okay, what I see here is a pattern, and this is just on the industrial base, as a way to take out a piece, right? In the case of the Kosovo War, we took it out with JDAMs. They could take it out by devaluing it and then acquiring it at a discount, and then they own it. And so if you take that concept and apply it to an integrated air defense system, and you say, okay, part of that is taking out communication centers, taking out the grid in certain cases, and you say, well, if you apply that methodology to critical communications, critical infrastructure, well, you can take it out with JDAMs, or you can own and control it. And that, so then it began to open up this wider lens for me to recognize that here was a plan playing out in front of my face, very much like we would take down a society using weapons of war. But then not only that, in the case of Milosevic, the people that were supporting him basically turned against him because they were seeing the destruction of their assets. So as I got more into this, and you start to look around DC and you see that the CEOs of these companies that the Chinese have acquired now become their biggest advocates in Washington, DC. So not only does it extend into taking certain pieces off the table for the United States, it also means that US, elites now become proxies for the Chinese Communist Party into our own political process. And if one of the things that you learn being in DC is that industry, our own industry, plays an enormous role in the policies that Washington, DC establishes on behalf of those industries. The airline industry has a big role in shaping FAA policies. The Goldman Sachs of the world, JP Morgan, the investment banks have a big role in shaping the policies of the Securities and Exchange Commission and of the Treasury Department. And U.S. corporations have a big role in shaping the policies of the Commerce Department. And so when you begin to see the linkages between what China was and the Chinese Communist Party had done, they'd essentially, by co-opting these leaders of industry, they had essentially injected themselves into the bloodstream of the policymaking process in the United States, so that not only could they take a piece off the table on behalf of the United States, if you will, but they could also inject themselves into the way that we did policy that then would lead to a positive outcome for the Chinese Communist Party. For instance, tariffs, right? Tariffs is one that our industry was complaining about because it affected their relationship with China. But tariffs was one of the ways that we could protect industries, if a piece, for example, and ensure that it could remain in the United States. So, essentially with globalization of the internet, what you'd created is allies between the Chinese Communist Party and our industry, which as you look at the nation as a whole, socially, politically, economically, financially, and we talk about dime all the time, they've completely bypassed the military, which was designed to insulate our institutions from undue influence, and they've gone directly to the DI&E, and now it's very much like, analogy to me is the way the Germans, went around the Maginot Line. They've just outflanked the U.S. military. And so if the U.S. military's responsibility to protect that, our sovereignty in terms of understanding our domestic policy, our national security policy, our foreign policy, and it no longer can effectively do that, then you start to get an understanding of how this is kind of played out.
Now, this is just one small vignette in a larger story that we're going to tell over the next hour or so. But you have an interesting personal path into coming to this awareness and this level of analysis. Would you provide for us kind of a pathway of your experience, and in particular, when you became Dr. Spalding, and what did that do to help crystallize the way you think now?
Well, so first of all, why I got a PhD, at the time, I was nearing the end of my initial enlistment, and my intent was to go to Wall Street, and make my fortune. And so that's why I started to get the PhD. It really had nothing to do with my military career. It had everything to do with the fact that I thought it was coming to an end. I happened to apply for the Olmsted Scholar Program and get accepted. And so that kind of changed my path, if you will. And it meant that, because of the payback period for that, that I was going to have a career in the military, even though that's not something that I had sought. By that time, I'd basically completed coursework and just had to do the dissertation. So, I had ulterior motives for getting my degree. But in the end, when it came right down to it, having that degree and really that perspective of macroeconomics and microeconomics really enabled me. It helped me to understand kind of the impacts of what I was seeing on the page, where maybe some of my colleagues couldn't, because we tend to be products of the things that we know and learn. And in the military, we're very focused on the mission. I remember being a co-pilot in the B-52 and trying to understand, target IP, how does that relate to policy that we're trying to achieve? What is our overall goal here? And being chastised by my colleagues saying, all you need to be focused on is IP to target. Well, I think, leaders, as they mature, they need to understand how all the pieces fit together, why we do things in the military, and then how that can achieve the proper outcomes. Because if you find yourself, as a captain, you're focused on IP to target, and then you find yourself as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, a senior military advisor to the president, and he says, well, okay, what do we need to do from a military perspective, and how's that translate into the policy, the outcomes that I'm looking for our national interests? If you haven't thought about that, and you hadn't thought about, by the way, what are the other levers that the president may have at his disposal to use, then it makes you a less effective leader in terms of strategy and diplomacy. Interestingly enough, I saw this play out for two different chairmen. One chairman had the approach, and this was regarding the islands in the South China Sea. One chairman had the approach of, we don't have a military solution to that because it's not something that we're willing to go to war over. Another chairman said, okay, well, the president's asking for a military solution to that. We're the military, we provide a military solution. It's up to him to decide whether or not it's one that we want to take. And I saw that play out in those two different chairmen. And really the latter was more effective because it forced the president to reconcile the fact, okay, the military is not an appropriate tool for this. Treasury Secretary, Commerce Secretary, Secretary of State, what do you guys propose that we do? In fact, if the Obama administration had approached it in that manner, in terms of policy, then they would have been more effective, because the cruel secret about the islands in the South China Sea is that our investment dollars were going to build those islands. So rather than the Pacific Fleet doing figure eights around islands, you could have turned to the Treasury Secretary and said, "Hey, I want all investment coming out of the U.S. to stop for these companies that are doing these things in the South China Sea." And that would have been far more effective at inhibiting the Chinese Communist Party. But being able, and I saw the chairman as a senior military advisor, the senior uniformed member of the National Security Council, have enormous sway in national security and foreign policy making process, but not having that insight or the ability to really look at the broader picture really just limits your ability as a military leader to provide that kind of advice.
No, fantastic. And one of the, I think similar to your opening comment, one of the phrases that we're playing with here is, there's a difference between providing a military solution or providing a political effect through military means, right? And so how do we contribute overall to whatever that political outcome is, not just through the capabilities we have resident? How do we support and provide, again, supporting fires to the interagency in some cases? So we have predominantly a special operations community audience with us today. So let me probe a statement you make that's directly related to SOF. The CCP uses guile, cunning, bribery, and bargaining to achieve desired outcomes. Or to put it in real terms, the entire strategy is built around political influence, information, and buying people off. That sounds a lot to me like political warfare. Would you concur? And if so, does this mean SOF has an important role to play in countering their strategy?
It is political warfare. And in fact, if you look at the history of the Chinese Communist Party, the way that they won the civil war in China was to essentially undermine the faith and confidence of the citizenry in the Nationalist Party, who had U.S. backing, U.S. funding, U.S. training. They in all respects were far more capable as a military force than the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army. But the Chinese Communist Party, basically waged political warfare and were successful. And so that's the way they look at conflict is through the lens of political warfare. And so when you kind of differentiate how our competition with the Soviet Union with our competition with China, the Soviet Union was kept really isolated from democracies. We didn't trade with them. We didn't have them in our universities. We recognized that they would be a corrupting influence on our political system. At the end of the Cold War, we basically threw off all those controls, all those policies, all those organizations, and said, the world is, safe now for democracy. Well, in fact, we made the world safe for the Chinese Communist Party to really spread their brand of control of the narrative, information operations, and political warfare all over the world.
So that's one of the ironies, right? The Western liberal international order essentially took the military solution off the table and made it very, very safe for the CCP to focus on those other elements of national power in order to accrue economic gains and so on and so forth. Now transitioning over to the M in a way that it wasn't able to or didn't want to do in the prior decades. Would you concur with that? Or?
Well, so what the problem is not only is the M ineffective, it's actually part of the Chinese Communist Party strategy. Xi Jinping wants us to spend more money on the military because if you go back to the Soviet Union, they parked their ships and planes and tanks. They parked them, and their leaders, their officers and enlisted were starving along with their families. And the reason I know this is because one of my friends helped the leadership of the Black Sea Fleet after the end of the Cold War scrap their ships so that they could have money to buy food. So what was the end of the Soviet Union was not a military defeat. It was an economic collapse. So what the Chinese use is not just the ineffectiveness of our military in countering their behavior, it also uses the amount of money that we spend on defense and therefore don't spend on our own infrastructure, manufacturing, science, and technology as a means of bleeding us in the same way that we kind of bled the Soviet Union. We bled the Soviet Union by isolating them economically, investing in infrastructure, manufacturing, science and technology, STEM education, and then just waiting for their system to crumble and collapse. They focused on military. If you look at the situation today, it's completely on the other foot. We're spending far more than the Chinese on the military, and they are not actually spending a corresponding amount on their military. They're focused on developing their science and technology, their infrastructure, and they're just basically much like, and it's what interestingly enough, it's very much like Osama bin Laden's strategy. It's really to bleed the West, to have us essentially be bankrupt. And there's many components to that. There's also a financial component. This need to erode the dollar. The collapse of the ruble was the collapse of the Soviet Union. You see what's going on with the digital coin in China, with the rise of Bitcoin. So first they were against Bitcoin, now they're for Bitcoin. It should not be lost on you that people like Michael Saylor and Elon Musk are now heavily invested in Bitcoin. What is the net effect of this? You're basically creating this movement away from the US dollar as a store of value. That's one of the ways that we are able to finance our debt, is by having a lot of people hold dollars. Less people hold dollars, the more the dollar weakens, the less valuable our currency becomes, the less people are willing to, the more interest we're gonna have to pay on our debt. So, I mean, there are synergies in the way that they're doing things. The military is just one aspect of the strategy.
So if we go back to, we'll come back to that a little bit later on in the questions, but if we go back to the idea of political warfare, you're right. Online positive publicity must become bigger and stronger. And this is from a CCP internal document. Must become bigger and stronger so that the party's ideas always become the strongest voice in cyberspace. And then you refer also to the Chinese public presence of good optics, portraying themselves as beneficial, using attractiveness and soft power really as a foundation for, and their generosity as a foundation for their foreign policy. So if this is a key component of their strategy, being an attractive rising power, non-threatening power, information warfare is a key component of this strategy. So if the developing world is a core audience for this, what role should SOF play in moving abroad and influencing populations in the global South? If any.
So you're good point. And Pottinger, Matt Pottinger, who was his deputy national security advisor, basically came on and gave a speech, maybe a week ago, said this two things that they say. One, we're inevitable, right? So you might as well not challenge us. And two, we're not a threat. We're inevitable, we're not a threat. And that just basically, kind of, it's like taking, your medicine with honey, right? It just goes down smoothly. And so there's nothing you can do. And even if there was anything that you could do, why do anything? Because we're just nice. It's very, very difficult to counter that argument when at the same time you're getting paid, right? You're getting financially incented. So how can SOF make a difference in this? So first of all, one of the things that we don't do very well is actually counter their propaganda with factual information. One of the things that I found is that my colleagues in the People's Liberation Army had been doing their job far longer than I had. The America's guy, Admiral Lee G, had been there for decades. And he could tell you chapter and verse about our policies under President XYZ and beyond, and what our policy had been, why we had that policy, and really kind of run circles around the political appointees and the State Department officials, because they just didn't have the depth of knowledge. So they actually looked at managing that relationship and who was doing that as a very important aspect of their strategy. So those people stayed in their positions a very, very long time. And I got to know them all very well. So, and they knew the strategy, they understood kind of their overall strategy. So control of the narrative really is so important. And if you don't know the story, in order to factually refute the story, then you're not an effective, you don't have an effective counter to that. And so really just acknowledging with facts. So I'll give you one example, and this played out in 2020. There was a report that came out of the Imperial College of London saying that over 2 million Americans were going to die as a result of the coronavirus. The subtext behind that report, first of all, the Imperial College of London's reports have been exceedingly biased in the more dangerous category for the entire time of the coronavirus. Exceedingly biased. More people are going to die. It's going to cause more challenges with regard to populations have come out of their reports than any other institution. Yet, when that report came out, it was carried by mainstream media in the United States. It was hyped by social media influencers. Then it was picked up and retweeted by, Chinese and, 50 Cent Army folks. And so it became the way that in conjunction with these videos that were escaping China of people just collapsing in the streets, it became a way to stir up fear with regard to the coronavirus. Now, the subtext to that is that in 2015, Xi Jinping visited Imperial College of London himself on a 4-day tour in the UK and committed millions of dollars to, among other things, epidemiology research at the Imperial College of London. So when you're thinking about, okay, what's SOF's role? I mean, we should have known that. Like that should have been the first thing that came out that said, hey, okay, Imperial College of London, you're a little bit suspect because you're taking money from the Chinese Communist Party, who has every incentive to inflame fear in the free world. Now, where else has this same kind of strategy played out? Well, it turns out that Huawei paid certain think tank people to write articles in European newspapers that were then picked up by the Huawei leadership themselves in Europe and retweeted to all their networks in Europe. And so it became a way to basically put pressure on the EU parliamentarians, not to accept this, hey, we need to get Huawei out of Europe message. So understanding who is involved, what is the true story, what are the other motivations behind, and then being able to quickly counter that disinformation and influence campaign is really one of the ways that I think that that SOF could be effective. Now, here's the problem. That stuff's going on in the United States as well. And that's a place where, SOF doesn't have a jurisdiction, but it certainly has jurisdiction in Europe, certainly has jurisdiction in Asia. And I think that's one of the challenges. When I went to Taiwan, I was there in January 2020. I caught the coronavirus, by the way, as a result of it. The Taiwanese had established non-governmental organizations. They had established policies within their government to recognize that influence campaigns were happening in Taiwan, to quickly and factually refute these influence campaigns. But some of these are so subtle that if you're not paying attention, you're going to miss. And this is where understanding the playing field and the networks involved is really going to help you. So if you look at, just in the medical field, most of our drugs come from China. That means most of our pharmaceutical companies are incentivized by what China wants. They're also incentivized by making money. And so when you put those two together and you begin to realize what's going on, you understand that there's a strong tie between the Chinese Communist Party and the making of how we do medical policy in the free world. And that played out in nowhere more blatantly than in 2020. And you just go back and just look at nearly everything that we did with regard to the coronavirus. The Chinese Communist Party, you can tie a Chinese Communist Party influence into the making of that policy. And so when you think about that, and you're like, well, how do we counter those types of things? It is really about understanding your adversary, understanding what they're doing, understanding their networks, and being able to go in there. In the case of Taiwan, it was within 24 hours, they were committed to putting out a refutation of fake news that they saw coming out in their social media. But I mean, it really has to be embraced. It's not just SOF alone. The whole government has to really understand that we're not in the 2020 kind of cold, or the 20th century Cold War type, where military force and geography play a big role in national security. It's really more about data and finance. And if you can grasp that, then you can take a step back, and I think you can have an effect.
Let's pull the thread a little bit on why corporations are kind of decentering from nation states for a moment. And one of the components that you talk about is you may have an American company, but operating globally, China being a major potential growth market. But there are a couple of barriers to their freedom of movement, one of which is the repatriation of dollars as profit. Would you talk about that a little bit, and how that winds up playing into the calculus of companies on what they can and cannot do with respect to pushing back from this on the CCP?
Right. Well, so I mean, there's 2 points. Let's use Tesla as a great example of this. So Tesla, their stock price, their growth model, their business plan is all related to how many cars that they think they're going to sell in the next 10 years in China. And they think they're going to sell a lot. Okay. So in order to be in China, then they have to conform to what the Chinese Communist Party wants. Now, with the way the party will enact, kind of begin to teach Tesla what they want, is to let them have their investment there, let them get their investment going, and then begin to put pressure on, knowing that they've invested the money. Their stock price is already kind of built in the fact that they think they're going to sell all these cars in China, and then they begin to force Tesla to do the things that they want. And Tesla is an incredible data collection engine. If you think about how the Tesla cars are made, particularly in the autopilot feature. So they get you in, and then they begin to put pressure on you, and in putting pressure on you, they get you to do the things that you want. At the same time, they don't allow you to take money out of the country. And so you're kind of, you're stuck. There's no way that you can. So once you begin to find this out, getting rid of your assets off your balance sheets is almost impossible. So now you're stuck. You can't get out. Your stock price is based on, what the story you've told to the market. Meanwhile, things are getting worse. But as long as you're playing by the rules, then China will allow you to continue to operate in China. But they begin to exert greater and greater control over the way you operate your business, and those profits stay in China. But if you're a corporate executive, you're Elon Musk, your compensation, particularly in his case, your compensation is based on what the stock price is, and the stock price, what the SEC and Treasury Department allow is that you claim those corporate profits in China, just like you claim corporate profits in the United States, even though you don't have access to them. And so when you do that, the stock price, your compensation is all tied to the value of the stock. And so once you're in, you can't get out, but you're incentivized to continue to play ball. And so that's the way that they slowly take control over corporate boardrooms and chief executive officers in terms of what they want them to do. What's interesting about Elon Musk is he also owns another company called SpaceX. Now, SpaceX isn't in China, but guess what? A significant amount of his net worth is tied up in Tesla. So now you have a little bit of a channel in to begin to exert pressure on SpaceX, which is something that we would consider to be more problematic from a national security perspective. But if you're not thinking kind of in this way, then you don't recognize how the Chinese Communist Party gained advantage and begin to exert things that they want done on people that we would consider to be acting independently.
It seems to me that someone needs to write the paper on the Hotel California financial investment strategy, right? So if we look at the difference, as you were saying, between the Soviet Union and China, where Soviet Union was essentially divorced from the international market, as we understand it, China adopted the other strategy, go all in on the international market and become this basin of attraction where everyone wants to flow to it for their own for their own benefit. But by being abroad and having their people as a large diaspora community in the business community, does that create an opportunity for engagement and influence outside the idea of this great Chinese firewall?
Well, that's a great question, and it's one that you kind of have to peel the onion back on. The Great Firewall exists both to prevent people that are geographically located within China from accessing information without going through a VPN or other means, but it also creates this ability to extend that Great Firewall, globally. How do they do that? Let's take WeChat as a good example. WeChat's owned by, or not owned, but it's basically used by over 1 billion people. And WeChat is what's called a super app. So once you're in WeChat, you can do everything that you want to do in China. Like you can buy airline tickets, you can buy train tickets, you can buy food, you can get a Didi Dacha, which is Uber equivalent car. You can talk to your friends, the taxi drivers. It's funny because they would have group voice chat in the taxi. So and it's hilarious to hear, because they would be zinging each other going down the street at 50 miles an hour, having these group chats, and everybody's laughing and having a great time. All that was happening within WeChat. Well, so now take the example of a Chinese student coming to a U.S. university. So the other thing that the Chinese do is there's no Twitter, there's no Facebook, there's no social media, U.S. social media apps allowed within China. So these apps, not only they become something that the Chinese people you really get to appreciate, they've locked you in. And so when these kids go to a U.S. university, they don't go there and then all of a sudden they're getting Facebook, and no, they're on WeChat and they stay on WeChat. And what's good about WeChat is not only is that data accessible by the government, they can curate the things that they want on that platform. So if there are things that they don't want people talking about, they just delete it off, right? Or they block people. And so now you take this person who's grown up in this stilted society where they only get one view of things, and they're taking that viewpoint with them because they're taking the tools that they use to communicate with their friends and family with them. Now, they say, well, what about the media? Well, it just so happens that all the Chinese language media in the United States is also controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, and the radio. So you get radio, you get TV, and then you got social media, basically where the Chinese Communist Party has 100% control over. And, these people who are now coming to America, speaking a foreign language, you have so many students in the universities. I think like University of Illinois had, something like 5,000 Chinese students. They tend to stay in their own kind of groups. They speak Chinese 80% of the time. And then they stay on these apps. And so when you say, okay, we used to think that you could effectively, once they cut tie with mother country, then you could basically imbue them with our principles and values when they came here. But what the Chinese Communist Party is they've created a system to keep them on their channel, right? Whether it be in social media or otherwise. And at the same time, they tell them quite clearly when they come over to the United States, don't become too Americanized, meaning don't listen to what they're saying, because if you do, you're not going to find a job when you get back home. So not only are they given the means to kind of stay in their own enclave, they're told if they go out of that enclave, and what'll happen is usually the embassy will become aware of it, or the consulate. Then somebody will from the Public Security Bureau will make a call back to the family. The family will call the kid in America and say, hey, you need to reel it back in because you're becoming too Americanized, meaning you're getting outside of your envelope. This happened to a girl that did a commencement address at the University of Maryland, and she was savaged by Chinese social media. And if you can imagine the having 1.4 billion Chinese, what the Chinese Communist Party likes to say, but basically your countrymen savage you because you're talking about the sweet taste of freedom in the United States, then you understand the enormous psychological pressure that the regime can put on these students to basically continue to toe the line. Now, there's good articles out there. There's a good one. Li Yuan, who's a New York Times reporter, talks about the deprogramming she had to go through when she left China to recognize that the immediate reaction, she said, when somebody said something about Taiwan in the university, she would immediately get angry and say, that's Chinese territory. That she had to recognize that had been built inside of her by this regime who does propaganda and influence right up through every grade level, and then has it kind of reinforced through media and social media. So, and she likened that in the article to a girl that wrote a book that had been essentially kidnapped as a child, held in captivity, and raised in kind of this weird, fringe group in Utah. And so she wrote a book about that and how, it was very hard for her to kind of deprogram herself. Li Yuan basically says in this article, my deprogramming myself from, what the Chinese Communist Party had programmed into me as a result of me being a Chinese citizen was like this process. And so if you think it's just going to be, it doesn't matter if it's the United States or Europe, if you're just going to go up to a Chinese person and say, hey, I'm going to befriend this person. I'm going to convince them that, liberal democracy and liberal democratic values are better. You've got a high bar to meet, because you're not just fighting that person's notions, you're fighting the system that goes with them when they leave China.
So there's certainly policy implications to what you're talking about. How do you open up the information space, whether within the United States, so that anyone who does travel here has access to passive information or whatever it might be. Or
just not have access to WeChat, right? Because what you're doing by allowing them to have access to WeChat, you're allowing the Chinese Communist Party to extend the Great Firewall into the United States. That's essentially what you've done. And so, I know that's not a soft thing, but one of the ways that you'd be able to cut those ties is by saying, okay, we're going to cut off. And then we're not going to allow the Chinese Communist Party to run the TV stations and the radio stations that are in Chinese language in the United States. And now this person's kind of been cut off from that. And if we don't have 500,000 Chinese students in our schools, they're more isolated. And now they can have regular interactions with the student body. And maybe through that process, you can create some kind of cultural or principled transfer of other ideas. But without that, forget about it. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party has engineered the internet environment so well around controlling the narrative that you're facing a massive, enormously well-funded system that thinks the most important thing that they have to do is to ensure that whatever a Chinese person thinks about, they are the proper things that the Chinese Communist Party has that believes that they should be thinking about.
And that's the most important point, I think, of our discussion this morning. It's all about the battle of perception. So if SOF is going to have value within competition, a very significant component of it will be in that battle of perception, not in the United States, but as we're engaging abroad, right? One of the challenges that you mentioned in your book is specifically using the term the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, instead of China, right? China seems like this giant unmanageable thing. The CCP is an organization just like every other with strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, right? You can do that kind of analysis on the CCP. You just mentioned that perception has to be controlled, otherwise it starts to weaken. So then the analytical question, and for SOF in particular, is, okay, where is its control and influence weakest? What are the things where can space be created, either geographically or because of geography and distance from other country? Populations have the ability to have access to information. What about second or third generation diaspora communities, so on and so forth? Do you have any thoughts on that for us that might help us analytically approach this?
Yeah, I think one of the problems you have, quite frankly, is that this information sphere has grown to encompass the globe. So you're fighting a system that is built to create one narrative for the world. That's essentially in the way social media has evolved, particularly in the United States. And today, United States leads, but it's soon going to be China. The way it's evolved, it's towards consensus and conformity. And so you're fighting this tendency for particularly the Silicon Valley tech companies in their systems to drive consensus and conformity. And I honestly don't know how you get around that unless you break that tie. Part of the problem with our own system is that Silicon Valley tech companies, are really, if you think about it, there's no limits on how they influence the US populace or anybody else. And this is kind of the reason that the EU put out global data protection regulation. So you have a real problem. Now, it could be that you work with foreign governments to educate them on this process, and then you begin to create this ability to disintermediate that through the infrastructure that gets built in these societies. I think that might be one way that you get at it. And if you do that, if you disintermediate it, then you have the capacity to basically stand in between Facebook or Baidu or Alibaba or Twitter, and really have the government step in and say, okay, this is proper, this is improper, and really have the government be able to ensure the independence and sovereignty of their own citizenry. I mean, that's a process that's going to take a while, but that's one way that you could do it. Otherwise, just trying to go in there and compete with the Facebooks and the Alibabas of the world, forget about it. SOF doesn't have enough resources to do that. You're talking about enormously powerful companies. But if you can disintermediate that at the infrastructure layer, then the government can begin to kind of filter those things and understand, okay, I've got influence coming from here, I've got influence coming from here, I'm going to disintermediate that. That might be a way to begin to think about it.
So one of the questions from the audience also wanted to discuss the idea of us sending raw materials over to China, which then get manufactured and brought back, and the implications on the balance of current account deficit as a part of that. I think you could also link that up with some of the financial investments that you had discussed in your book. Would you be willing to talk about how do we think about that? And while that's more of a domestic policy kind of thing, I imagine it also would help us analyze how other countries are also experiencing China.
Well, I mean, again, so here is a system that has grown up in China that is specifically impervious to financial attack. And so they've created this dual currency system, and now it's a tri-currency system, or actually quad currency system. So internal to China, into its borders, the renminbi, the Chinese yuan is a currency of exchange. Now, the way money gets into China primarily is through Hong Kong. So Hong Kong dollar ends up being another currency that the Chinese Communist Party has access to. Hong Kong dollar is freely traded. The yuan is strictly, and its exchange is strictly managed by the People's Bank of China. So if you think about that, the Hong Kong dollar becomes this funnel that funnels money in. You know, it's freely traded currency. And a lot of equities, stocks, Chinese stocks, are actually what's called American depository receipts held in Hong Kong that match a share in stock that's on the Shenzhen market, for example. Well, as that money comes in, that dollar makes its way from Hong Kong into the People's Bank of China on mainland China. And the People's Bank of China then exchanges that dollar for yuan at the rate that it decides. There's no market set, it's the PBOC itself. So what's happened is now this bringing this money in is a money-making operation for the Chinese Communist Party, because they can take their cut off the top based on the currency exchange. But then because of that, you know, this idea that, you know, if you have you know, bad debt in China, and you have 300% of GDP is now tied up in debt, and low scores, you know, I think the number is like 50% in non-performing loans. So they have all this growing debt. It's not getting, the interest is not getting paid, the principal is not getting paid. But what would usually happen in that kind of system is that you would have capital flight, right? You'd have all this growing debt, and then people would say, okay, I see a risk for my money, I'm going to pull my money out. But because the People's Bank of China doesn't convert unless, you know, the Communist Party agrees, you can't pull the money out. So now it becomes stuck. So it's like this fish trap where money keeps going in and it can't come out. And so when you think about that in terms of the trade balance between the US and China, which is what the question was.
Right.
Okay, so when you have a country that's exporting a bunch to another country, what happens is there's a corresponding currency trade. And what happens in the corresponding currency trade is that tends to raise the value of the other currency. So what that means is these products get more expensive. And when they get more expensive, that balance of trade begins to even out. Okay. But the system I just described to you ensures that there's no corresponding free trade of the currency. Basically, the Chinese party controls how that currency is exchanged. So they've created this perpetual currency imbalance that allows for trade so that their exports are always going to be above our. Now, the tariffs were meant to kind of bridge that gap, but all they do is basically, you know, push that back down with subsidies to the companies and then managing the currency trade. So you're in the situation where no matter what, if you're making a US company compete on a one-to-one basis with a Chinese company, there's no way they can compete. The Chinese have fixed the game. And so what that means is over time, you lose all your industry. And so in fact, you know, what's happening is we're becoming a supporter, a supplier of food, raw materials, and energy to China, where they basically do all the manufacturing. Now, if they want to do that, if you think about how we won the World War II and how we won the Cold War, well, not so much the Cold War in terms of military production, but it's really on the force of our economy and our productivity, which we basically, because of and due to this process, has been decimated. So it is a system that, you know, the Treasury Department and the SEC is allowed to develop. And what happens is the reason Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan support it is because they get paid for every American, you know, a percentage of every American dollar depository receipt that gets sold into our institutional investors, which are basically retirement funds. So our retirement funds are the money that's getting pushed into the funnel that's getting stuck in China that powers their military, their Belt and Road Initiative, their industry, their, you know, they're empty cities. I mean, the whole thing is it's actually quite incredible. And you think about it, and I talk about this in the book. They've got cities that will hold 10 million people that are completely empty. Now, once you start to fill, the only way that you fill those cities up is to basically devalue the real estate and get all of those poor people into those cities, which creates its own economic process, because they're going to have to fill those things with furniture and everything. Well, in doing that, who's loaned the money for that real estate? American banks. So they have to take a big write-off, but they don't get any of their money out because there's no way of bringing it back out. So I mean, they built a really good mousetrap, and we just let them.
And to that point, there's no way for the companies to really know the true value of their assets, which if you take a look at what happened in 2008 with the real estate crisis, it was the same thing. Am I correct in that?
Right. I mean, there are so in accounting practices, the Federal Accounting and Standards Board, FASB, basically tells companies how to list things on their balance sheet, and there's a categorization of assets: level 1, 2, and 3. Level 1 asset is like cash in the bank, like it's totally liquid. You can go get it out. Level 2, it's like real estate, things that you have to sell, takes time to basically turn liquid. And then level 3 is like, has no value. You can't really count it on your balance sheet. If you can't return money that's in China, it's not like cash in the bank. It's not even like, assets like buildings and equipment. It's like there's no value to it. But FASB takes direction from the U.S. Treasury, allows U.S. corporations to count money in the bank in China as a level 1 asset. So now when you go and look at the 10Ks and the 10Qs and you say, hey, well, how's this company performing? Oh, they got all this money on the balance sheet in China. But as we've seen, I think it was last year or the year before, there's this company reported to the market, had $6 billion in a bank account, and it came back and it said, you know what? That $6 million is gone. We don't know where it went. I mean, if you're just like, and there is no recourse. All those stockholders of that company are like, and then the stock price goes down. You have no recourse. I mean, it is. There's a guy, Patrick Genevine, in the book. He had a company, Tang Energy. It was a wind. They were building wind turbine blades. China came in, was a joint partner. Actually, AVIC, Aviation Industry Corporation of China, which is the largest defense contractor in China, became a partner of theirs, stole their company, re-diverted financing, hired their general manager, and company was gone. This is a kind of behavior that goes on, and there's no recourse for either investors or the company themselves. It's just it's a trail of tears that goes on and on.
So this is a very interesting point, because it identifies something that we are playing with sub-sovereign operations, right? So in the end, what you're saying is, look, it's not military to military, government to government. A lot of the advance politically is at the corporate level, and the corporation winds up becoming the means of spreading influence and changing the geopolitical balance. So if we look at what is, say, a soft value or a military value, it's actually supporting other components of the U.S. government in doing this kind of analysis. If we were to look at it from that perspective, how would you recommend that the military starts to view its role in something like integrated campaigning, which the Joint Staff specifically says, military, go out and compete, don't fire a shot, support the other interagency components of U.S. power? And what might soft analysis contribute, or based on our placement around the world?
So, I mean, here's where it really gets tricky, because we have, separation between the private sector and the public sector in the United States, and particularly with the military. But what you do have, and what I've noticed is The soft community, kind of like the Marines, it's less so in the other services, but has this cadre of people that exist out of the service, and these linkages tend to be very strong. I think that one of the ways that you make a contribution is, number one, educating people on these challenges, and then recognizing some of them are going to choose to leave and go out in the private sector. And now you've got a linkage with that person. And now that you have this kind of common sense of or framework for competition, understanding that, making money in the private sector and free market capitalism is very much a part of our system, but understanding that piece has been hijacked in a very specific way to undermine our way of life and our society, recognizing that, being able to articulate that, and then getting adherence by that from those informal networks is a way that that the soft community can contribute. And it is really by understanding the world that we're in. For me, I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution. What I recognized for my own self was that I could be far more effective on the outside without any of the inhibitions of the government. In fact, the government might not even let me participate in the way that I needed to participate in order to be effective in this competition by sharing my knowledge, right? Restricting what I say. But if you can do that, if you can create broad-based leaders that rise through the ranks and understand that, it's not just what's at the end of my gun that matters, it's also what's in between, my ears. And if I can create this understanding of, how competition exists in the 21st century is far different than what I've been led to believe. And a lot of the stuff that's really exciting, is great. But there's a lot of stuff that's not so exciting that really exists in a very tangible way that impacts our national security and our independence and sovereignty going forward, creating those ties, and then that system to educate, to inform. Because look, the incentive system on the outside is completely different than the incentive system in uniform. You have one thing, and that is to support and defend the Constitution. If you're out, the Constitution has doesn't play in a boardroom. It's a fiduciary responsibility to the shareholder. What you have to create are business models that enable you to support the shareholder while at the same time you're supporting the Constitution. That takes creativity. That takes innovation. That takes thinking outside of the box. All of those tools, I would venture to say, are a key component of the way soft works, right? It's unconventional. You tend to attract people that think differently, that want to act differently. And that community extends beyond the people that are in active military. And so I think creating those bonds and leveraging those bonds and educating and allowing those people that are in the private sector to be those that choose to continue to be patriots supporting their country in this way, I think may be one avenue. But to be honest, we are in a completely different world that our political leaders don't understand, our corporate leaders don't understand, our academic leaders don't understand, and quite frankly, terrifyingly to say, our military leaders really don't understand. It's not their world. They are like I was, IP to target. Let's focus on.
Sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you.
Sorry, that was Siri. Like me, IP to target. They're focused on the mission. Well, if you can't take a step back and recognize the interplay here, then you're not going to be effective in this fight.
So as you were working in the NSC, a lot of these ideas were relatively new with your colleagues, as you recount in your book. Now that you've had a few years of building relationships and awareness with colleagues, what are you seeing out of the current administration? Are you seeing some continuity or some differences? What's your take at this point on where you expect policy to go towards the CCP?
Well, obviously, you've seen the Biden administration, maintain a lot of the policies with regard to China. What you have is, at least among national security professionals, the recognition that there was a big piece of the puzzle that they were missing. They're starting to embrace that. But when what you see in DC is this enormous pressure from industry to say, let's just play ball with the Chinese because it's going to hurt us, our quarterly reports and our annual reports if we don't. And so there's still a fight in DC where you have policymakers that want to change course, but they're dealing with the fact that these corporations put money into political campaigns, right? They back candidates, they back political narratives. It's part of the system that we have. So you're in many ways you're fighting an uphill battle, and it requires not just the understanding of national security professionals. It requires the understanding of the broader public to recognize that this is going on. One of the reasons when you read my book, what you'll notice is a lot of the things that I say in there are not the way I would say them. Some of them sound kind of sensational. I had a co-author that, really wrote for, I thought much better than I could for the public that, so the book is it's easy to read. It doesn't sound like there's certain military terms, my friends like, why would you say it that way? Well, I didn't say it that way. My co-author said it that way, but I thought it would be easier for people that have no military experience to understand because it's not said in the way I would say it. And so my goal was to basically get out and reach the public. How do I get this into the minds of people? But my reach is very, very small. I've sold 50,000 books. I've done public speaking, but when you think about it, I'm just a small pebble in a big, big, big ocean. And we need a lot of small pebbles in that big ocean that understand the issues and can articulate them. And that's another avenue that soft, education and development, and certainly, commitment to the cause can bring.
Another question we had from the audience was, you had mentioned 500,000 Chinese students in the United States and what that means as, frankly, an influence campaign. In your book, you describe that the threat to withdraw tuition because of the dependence of the education industry on foreign students, and a very substantial component, Chinese full tuition paying students, that becomes its own kind of influence campaign as well. And you describe that this is probably not just a US phenomenon, that there are other ways that the CCP is using essentially elite theory, right? Target the top 2% of any country, figure out what their interests are, co-opt them based on those interests, and then get them addicted to the system as they've designed it, and then pull strings. I know we can't really apply that to our own society in soft, but how does this inform what we should be thinking about as we analyze partners and potentially allies and their vulnerabilities?
Well, I mean, look, when you go to these places, you're going to find Chinese money everywhere. It's not, if you don't understand the way Chinese money is used to influence the leadership, then it's very hard for you to articulate that. It's not quid pro quo. I think that's the hardest thing to wrap your mind around. If you can just accept that we're inevitable and then we're not a threat, that's good enough for me, because that means you'll take my money. Well, if you take my money, and in the case of the administration or the administrators at universities, if you take my students, now that's a key component of your bottom line. If I pull those away, I've got you. So now that becomes a string that I can get you to do what I want. Same thing in foreign countries. So just establishing that these financial ties don't come without strings. They actually have strings, and the strings are pulled by the Chinese Communist Party when and if they need to be pulled, and they're pulled in the direction that promotes the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. So in essence, you're not getting something for nothing. You're getting something for your willingness to accede to the interest. And the two PLA colonels said that very well. It's how do I get you to basically abide by my interests? And it's really, that's the way to think about it. So being able to articulate that fact in a way that, the Chinese aren't going off and buying a political leader. They'll do things like, for example, Nellis Air Force Base. Outside of Nellis Air Force Base, and Nellis is one of our most critical, airfields for some of the things that go on out there. There was a company building a factory. Company's name was Faraday Futures. Faraday Futures was a competitor of Tesla. It's an electric EV car. So they're building an advanced Chinese company building an advanced, manufacturing facility off the departure end of one of our most secure bases. Now, what happened next was the mayor of Las Vegas went to the wing commander at Nellis Air Force Base and said, please don't say anything about the fact that the Chinese are building this production facility off the departure end of your runway, because my constituents need those jobs, right? So he wasn't being paid to be a traitor. He wasn't acting against the interests of the United States. He was acting for the interests of his constituents, which were the citizens of Las Vegas. So when you think about what the Chinese Communist Party, they do, and they do this often, for instance, remember they said Foxconn is going to build this manufacturing facility in Wisconsin. The Chinese are going to invest $86 billion in West Virginia for natural gas. None of those ever materialize. If you go back and look at each of those things, Faraday Futures ended up not actually coming into fruition, but they all become efforts and opportunities for the Communist Party to wage influence. And in some cases, they actually do come to fruition, and they are employing Americans. There's a good video on Netflix that talks about a manufacturing facility. I want to say it's in Detroit, that a Chinese billionaire steps in and basically restarts, employs the people. Now you've got a whole constituency just in those employees that are in that factory, basically singing the praises of the Chinese Communist Party. Not in so many words, but basically they're there to be spokesmen for the Chinese Communist Party, not in a direct way, but an indirect way, and saying, hey, what they're doing here helps me. And so when you understand those relationships and how they can be used in a way that's not, and we're very in tune to graft and corruption. I paid a politician to do a vote for my business. People understand that. What I'm talking about is a completely different way of thinking about influence. And if you're not familiar with that and you can't articulate it and provide examples of it, then you're going to be very ineffective at talking to foreign leaders when you say, they're inevitable, they're not a threat, why don't I take their money? Well, you don't take their money because basically they're counting on you to be their proxies in running that country in the way they want you to run it.
So as we transition the conflict space up to space, one of the questions from the audience is there a correlation between the creation of U.S. Space Force and CCP ambitions? Anything that you can discuss with us on that?
Yeah, I think so. I think one of the things that you're going to see from space is the increasing use of space as a platform for the processing and movement of data. And I think that's an incredibly important part of this overall competition. And then, I think the Chinese really see, the moon and the resources on the moon, particularly energy, as an opportunity as well. So I think one of the things that the Chinese are doing a good job of is taking that funnel, bringing our dollars in, using them to develop their technology, their infrastructure, which includes space. For their event, again, it's three-dimensional chess. You're thinking about long-term. How do I preserve our democratic republic in the face of a system that's basically designed to destroy it from within? And recognize that in 30 years, I haven't invested in infrastructure. I haven't invested in manufacturing, science and technology, STEM education. Our infrastructure in this country is grade D. And space is what we used to lead on. And now if you look at what's going on, we're no longer leading in that. And I would venture to say, if there's a possibility for the Chinese to have an ability to prevent us from having access to space because they control the on-ramp to space, which is something that we've talked about, we could very well see ourselves being, having no options when it comes to that. So very important component to the overall strategy. And these are long-term strategies. They require investment. They require thought. They require that we have commitment as a nation. And there's this dirty little secret that says, America can't have the same foreign policy from president to president, can't have the same national security policy. No, we established a very, very consistent policy with regard to the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And if you look at each president that came in after Eisenhower, it was very consistent. And we kept that going on in various levels, but still in the same kind of vein all the way up till the end. And so we can have a consistent foreign policy. We can have a consistent national security policy, but we actually have to recognize it's going to span beyond 4 years. It may take 20, 30 years, but we have to have that long-term vision when we think about things. The other thing that doesn't ever come up in national security policy is this idea of opportunity costs. If I spend $1 on here, that means I can't spend $1 over here. When we talk about national security, and I spent almost 27 years in the Air Force, never once did I hear the word, if I spend $1 here in Afghanistan, that means I'm not spending in my schools. But the fact remains, one year in Afghanistan, the money that we spent on 1 year in Afghanistan would put 200,000 American kids through 4 years of STEM degree. Now, every 5 years, that's 1 million new scientists and engineers trained by federal dollars. Now, did we ever talk about that? No, we didn't talk about it, but it's a key component of the competition when you consider the fact that my son graduated from Mizzou, and he was the only kid that was American in computer science. He graduated with honors. If you look down that row, all the rest were Chinese. Every single one of the other students, because I looked at their names, he was the only American student there. All the rest were Chinese. That's what I'm talking about. It's these long-term commitments to understanding the competition as it is, not as we would wish it to be, and then keeping a commitment to that.
So moving forward, right? This is a bit of a high-level challenge, but it almost seems overwhelming in a way because they've done such a masterful job of statecraft, with a non-military flavor. But there are opportunities. There are vulnerabilities within the CCP, within the Chinese economic system, legitimacy being a key component, right? So most of their goblins are probably focused internally, less externally. So what are the vulnerabilities of the CCP, and what might SOF do to contribute to mitigating some of their growth rate, raise the costs of their external relations? What might we think about doing as part of our contribution?
Well, I mean, it's part of that narrative. The biggest vulnerability for the Chinese Communist Party, the social contract through which they maintain legitimacy in the country, is by ensuring that the economy continues to grow. And that's in order to provide jobs for the Chinese people. And so in nearly all cases, you have these profit centers that are really driven by the Chinese Communist Party to maintain legitimacy. So if you can pick at them a little bit, you create problems. Of course, it's really going to be solved when we have better trade and monetary policy. But I mean, let's take the fishing industry for one. Millions and millions of pounds of frozen fish come out of China. 50% of their catch is exported, right? They have their trawlers going all over the world, basically destroying the world's fisheries. A lot of those in our own backyard in Latin America. To the extent that we can help the Latin American countries and some of the countries of Africa disrupt, disable, create problems for these fishermen, then you create problems for them maintaining jobs. That's just one example where giving these countries the means to resist the outright raping of their environment, I think is one way that you can create an impact. And again, China's a big country. Every little impact on the economic growth of the country creates a splinter into their legitimacy. The reason the Chinese people don't counter what the Chinese Communist Party does or says is because, hey, if I got a home, I can send my kids to school, I can make a better life for my kids, and I can have everything I want. Why do I care about politics? That's the way most people are. It's when those things start to not work and the economy begins to slow and employment begins to be a problem that you start to see people saying, okay, I care now because they're not meeting my needs anymore. And so that's, in my estimation, one of the ways that you can begin to look at, okay, how is the Chinese Communist Party exploiting this country? What are the tools that I can help the country have or develop that would prevent the Chinese Communist Party from easily exploiting this country? And then through that, allow that ripple effect to go back through the Chinese economy and create challenges for them.
We tend to think in the soft community in the terms of countering. That might be a little bit more pervasive across the rest of the conventional forces as well. I'm not really versed with that, but at least countering is a very strong mindset within the soft enterprise. But we're in this conversation discussing something different. It's more about seizing the initiative rather than just countering, right? So what in PME should we be thinking about in terms of education and structuring that conversation? What have you found in your interactions that has been a useful frame for broaching the topics?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. DIME, DIME was like taught throughout my PME, all of my years, but it's mostly as a familiarization. These are important, but don't think about them. Actually, we need to think about them because, we're warriors. We're not fighting in the M. We're fighting the DI and E. The Commerce Department, Treasury Department, State Department aren't warriors. They don't think of the world that way. And so if we can't offer them solutions or ideas or thoughts on how to better compete, who's going to do it? They're not. It's not part of how they're educated or developed. And so we actually need to understand practically how these things happen, how they work. And when we have the opportunity to because you find that there are DoD people all over the interagency, but they don't have the tools to understand how to really make a difference. They're more kind of in the observe and learn mode. You really have to have the tools of understanding to then be able to offer solutions to your colleagues. And then when you're part of the interagency discussion or at the National Security Council staff having a discussion on some policy, then what I saw during my time at the Joint Staff, if you're wearing a uniform, and we're talking about the DI and the E, nobody speaks up. Like, oh, that's not my purview. Meanwhile, the competition is happening in the DI and E, and none of those people that are speaking for the DI and E actually understand competition at all. They have no concept. They don't even understand that that's the way the Chinese wage war. And so being able to be a productive part of that conversation is really how we add value to the interagency. And right now we're basically going in and we're like, oh, it's not my, we're not talking about the M. I guess I'll keep quiet this time. So that's one of the things that I saw. And one of the things that I think that, if you're really going to talk about DI and E in an education setting for SOF or anybody else that's in the military, have a practical understanding of it. It's not just like some kind of, hand waving going on, but really understanding how things work so that when you have the opportunity to engage with your partners and you can basically offer some perspective that's different, they'll listen to you. They might, what it starts off, they're like, why is this person talking? And over time, I experienced this at the National Security Council staff. If you know more about the subject than the people that are there, they're going to listen to you. But you have to demonstrate that you put in the time and effort to understand it and then be able to articulate it in ways that really is in their language, not your kind of military jargon.
What kind of specialties or disciplines should the military start to cultivate or seek out then in order to be able to naturally see the things that your education allowed you to see, right? International relations as a typical major might not be what we want. Military history might not be what we need. So, in your experience, what kind of organic development can we encourage
Yeah.
so that people do have the natural, or personnel do have the natural ability to interpret what they're seeing around them?
Right. I think one of the ways that you can basically, I look at this as like a series of boot camps that you have for people as they're coming up. But what you need to do is that you need to bring in, people from the community that have gone in the private sector, bring their expertise in, and then basically level set the entire room, guys that are and gals that are active and guys and gals that aren't, and say, okay, here's the environment as we see it, the playing field. How do we arm ourselves with the type of knowledge so we can make informed, advice to our counterparts, knowing that this is the way our adversary is behaving. And then as you have these opportunities, you can go out and share that. And oh, by the way, in doing that, now you've informed kind of this informal network that you have in the private sector of what's going on, and they can further kind of inoculate, if you will, their boardrooms and their C-suites on the challenges. I don't think you're not going to get it. You're not going to get this in the university. For me, it was really just talking to business leaders and understanding, intimately how each of these processes worked, and then be able to back that into, okay, my job is to figure out how we do this as a nation. Now, you don't have to have that level to get at this. You just need to begin to generate some awareness. And then when you have a problem or an opportunity, then you can go out and start asking questions of your network to say, hey, how should I look at this? And how might I craft? And this is what I did. Like, I bring people in, hey, how would you craft policy? This is how I learn about level 1, 2, and 3 assets and all of these different policies that we have in the government that enable things, and begin to say, okay, well, let's go after that. That's where I think this could be. You're not going to get it by sending people off to spend a year at Princeton. That's just not going to be it. They need to be, toe to toe with people that actually are practitioners in the corporate, in the financial space, in the venture space, to understand how the world works, and then be able to kind of back into changes that need to be made.
We have about a few more minutes. We would like to offer you any concluding thoughts or recommendations that you might have to us in the Joint Special Operations University or the larger SOF community. I did want to at least provide some immediate feedback from our audience, which note saying this must be elevated to the Biden administration, congressional hearings, right? The message that you're bringing and helping to illuminate the approach. And then how do we innovate as a national security complex to deal with this kind of challenge? One final question, as it just popped into my mind, does this require something broader? Does it require, say, a 1947 National Security Act kind of study to really reimagine what the nation state is, what the global connections are, or are we just trying to jam a 20th century construct into a 21st century problem?
Well, I think what I've discovered, in the last, almost 10 years, is that you have to take these things in bite-sized pieces, and everybody kind of has to, go at it in their own way. One of the benefits of living in a free society is the ability to innovate and kind of think outside the box and do things differently. I think when you look at how we gained our independence and how we've kept our freedom, over the last 240 plus years, it has been Americans that have, essentially come together, rallied around the idea of the Constitution and preserving the Constitution as an idea, and then going about and doing that in their own way, and in their own communities, and in their own and in the things that they find that they have passion about. it's very hard to get this nation in focus into doing very big programs. But if you look at the guys that crossed the Delaware, and you look at the people that were basically standing against tyranny in the revolution, the majority of Americans were just fine with the British, right? It was a few that said, look, I'm not going to take this crap anymore, and I'm going to fight. And it just so happens that we're in the same kind of environment, and we're not, and everybody's not going to get there in terms of, wanting to fight, but the ones that are, if they do it in a way that in their own way, that comes together and really kind of gets at this, I think individually, then collectively we start to make a difference. Where there's no easy answer to what I'm telling you. There's a million different ways that the Chinese Communist Party is undermining us. They've thought hard about it. They've got the resources. They're embedded in our system. It's Americans believing in America and the idea of America and the Constitution, standing up in their own communities and in their own ways. It's going to make a difference. I think that we're going to innovate our way out of this. But at first, it takes recognition. And what I see happening over the last 3 or 4 years, when I started this in 2014, I started basically saying, okay, I've had the wool pulled over my eyes. I was hook, line, and sinker, China. And now I'm like, I realize, holy smokes, we're going down this very, very bad path. The first thing that I did is I had to educate myself. And then once I was educated, I could begin to talk to people about it and have honest conversations. And what happens is if you have a fact-based conversation, is that people begin to understand that, particularly if they read the book, they begin to see, okay, this I understand now what the problem is. And then they begin to attack it in their own ways. Some of them may be effective, some of them may not be effective, but I think acting independently is kind of consistent with our history as a nation. This isn't going to be a war where we pick up muskets and rush towards the sound of guns. It's going to be a war where we do our part in our own communities to reestablish and affirm belief and respect for the Constitution as a document and an abiding principle, and then work to reestablish that idea in our system. And I think people that have been in the military, that have sworn an oath to the Constitution, have lived and died next to brothers and sisters in arms, are better suited to that than just about anybody. But they got to know that the fight's going on. Otherwise, it's it's very easy to kind of be lulled to sleep.
And General Spalding, thank you very much for sharing your insights with us today. That was a wonderful way to conclude, because it is uplifting. We've been through this before. In the late 60s, it was the Soviet Union that was going to overtake us inevitably. In the 1980s, we were worried about Japan Inc. overtaking us. And then a few years later, it was, 30 years of the Western Liberal International Order. So there is opportunity to compete. You've provided a tremendous wake-up call. Thank you very much for joining us today. And we look forward to hopefully learning from you again in the future.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.